Terminator, I use that on Tank all the time. He does shed, but mostly it's his undercoat at this time of the year. But it's different from like most of the wire brushes and stuff. Like that just kind of pushes the hair around. But the Terminator, it's like they've got really short metal tines, but they work really, really well. And I've also discovered that it's best if I terminate him when he's standing in the bathtub before I give him a bath, so then there's not like big clumps of hair flying around my house. But yeah. Sure, I'm full of all kinds of useful information today, including dog grooming. Okay, let's see. Okay. Ooh, we're gonna have some fun today. Assuming the network wants to cooperate. That's not really what I wanted. That's okay. How's everybody doing? Working on projects? I have to get to a meeting shortly after class, so if you were planning to like form a line of laptop holding supplicants after the class, you're going to have to just drop me an email or just post your draft onto Basecamp. Again, I am a person who is highly invested in the process of your education, which is why I do draft projects, right? Because if we just have a project and a big deadline and you turn it in, then I could give you a grade and we could all move on with our lives, but I'm not convinced that you'll learn much. And most of the learning that actually happens is not in your initial stab in the dark, but it's from, when you're going back and making changes and getting feedback and stuff like that. So that's a major part of my teaching. So today I want to dive deeper into typography and in terms of like how it's handled in CSS, so that we can look at some of the advanced typographical features that you might not even be aware exist in the world. But the first thing I wanted to talk about is how we measure type. We've got the M unit, which of course I haven't been using as faithfully as I should. What is the sizing that we get from the M unit? What is that derived from relative to a typeface? There's an M, and we have an M unit, the cleverly named M. What is an M? Do you remember? We make an imaginary square, which of course this is not at all a square. Let's try to make it a little bit more square-like. We make an imaginary square, that's closer to a square, around the uppercase M of any given typeface, and that's an M. Okay, so that's what it comes from. But what I want to talk to you about is some of the basics of type anatomy and how we measure them. So let's put some letters up on the board, like a lowercase x and a lowercase, I'm exaggerating here somewhat, a lowercase l, which I realize I'm drawing to make somewhat like a number 1. And let's do a capital H. This is some of the most delicate drawing I've ever done. Oh, and I'm not even close to the bottom. There we go. So how many imaginary, we need a descender too. So let's draw a lowercase g. With a nose. That's actually called the ear, but it looks more like a nose. We'll call it an ear. Okay. So what are the imaginary lines? Let me draw the X out real nice so it looks similar to these things that we've got up here. So what is one line that you know of with regard to typefaces and setting type? Have we talked about any lines? Line height, which is used to set a what kind of grid? Baseline. Thank you, Villa. Baseline. Okay. So what is the baseline? The baseline is the line that the bottom of all these pieces of type sit on. And oftentimes we'll see, particularly with rounded characters, like a lowercase o or an a, the bottom of those things will dip down a little bit below the baseline of text. Okay? The reason for that is if you have something like a lowercase letter that ends in a flat thing like that, if we did the circular part sitting on the same line, it would look like it was going to tip over. So generally, we put the rounded part, or most typefaces are designed so that the rounded part sits ever so slightly below the baseline like that. Okay? So we have a baseline. Okay? And then we have this thing, which comes across here, and my H is wrong, so let me redraw that. It's not totally wrong. And of course, if we look at a typeface like Banquiat, it would be perfectly right, but a lot of times we'll see these arms on capitals align with this particular line. Does anybody know what that line is called? So this is baseline. That's the reason I drew the letter X there. This is our X height. All right? And you'll see certain typefaces have a much taller X height than others do. So for example, if we looked at like a capital H with regard to an X in a typeface like Garamond, I'm going to exaggerate this a bit, but we might see something like that, where we have a really short X height. If we look at other typefaces like Helvetica, we'd see that the X height relative to the capital is taller. All right? Which one do you think is probably easier to read over long stretches? Tall X height or a short X height? Okay, some are saying short. Why would you say short? It's not as distracting to the eyes. What do you think?
I feel like it's just less space to look at in general.
Okay.
You get fatigue less.
Okay. These are good answers, right? And we can sometimes see very, like if you remember the word shape thing, right? If we have a really dramatic X height, or a dramatic difference between that and the capital, we can see shapes differently. However, over long stretches, we generally want a more generous X height. Okay? You'll sometimes find, like, if you get wedding invitations that aren't in the crazy, flowy script font, you'll sometimes find typefaces that have a really exaggeratedly small X height on the lowercase letters. It looks really elegant, but it's a pain to read beyond a certain point. So generally, we're looking for a nicer X height. All right? So we have that line. Then we have this line. Anybody want to venture what that line is called? What's it the same height as? The H height, yeah. Threw you off by using the letter. Particularly, it's the top of this thing. We call this the cap height. It's the height of the capital letters, like that. Now, in some typefaces, all of the characters will fit within that top line, but on a lot of other typefaces, we'll have a second line. Anybody want to guess what that line is called? Ascender height. Okay? Named for this structure here, like on an L or a K, right? The spine of that thing that goes up. And so we have an ascender height up there. Then, down here, we have another line. Guess what it's called? If that's ascender, descender, right? So this is our descender line. Okay? And that's for all the descenders. So what happens when we set too tight or type too tightly? It's when these descender lines clash with the ascender lines, or sometimes in extreme cases of really poorly set type, start colliding with the cap height of the line below. All right? Now, when we're setting line height in CSS, we are generally talking about this entire expanse. Each browser is a little bit different, all right, which is why we don't want to play it too fast and loose with a really tight setting, because it's possible on some devices that might be even tighter. But generally, when we're talking about line height, we're talking about this whole thing, from the very bottom of the lowest descender to the very top of the highest ascender, which again, in certain typefaces may be the same as the cap height, but oftentimes there's a little bit of a difference there. Okay? All right. So that's type sizing. So let's talk about sizing and faces. And specifically, I put together, this is kind of an in-joke in my family. Because I always say, like, I was in grad school, I'm like, yes, I'm in English department, but I'm not studying Moby Dick. So here's a piece from Moby Dick, all right, which I used to teach web design, which is what I'm actually doing these days, right? So I've got a heading 1 element here that's using the small tag. We've got a site tag here for Moby Dick and the Whale by Herman Melville. There's his birth date there. And then we have the actual chapter title here. And here's some paragraph text from the opening lines of text. And I took this off of Project Gutenberg, and I have cited it like a responsible person here in the comments. All right? And I've also written a tiny little bit of CSS that is reflective of what we wrote in CSS last semester, which is to say I've set a base font size here. This is a little bit more generous at 22 pixels. I've set a line height that's about 120% at 26 pixels. And then I've set my heading 1, which, as you recall from my source code, says from Moby Dick or the Whale by Herman Melville, so it's got some details. So I've not set that heading large at all, despite the fact that it's a heading 1. It's the same size. All I've done here is to add some padding to the top. So when we add padding to the top of an element, when we're talking about text, we're talking about this area up here. And when we add more to the bottom to get more space, we're talking about padding down here. All right? I mention that because this is how we can do more clever things with aligning type. And hopefully if the gods smile upon us in terms of the time we have allotted to us today, we'll do some things with this and form elements. All right? And then here I've got my nice dramatic heading 2, which I've set at a whopping 61 pixels, and then a line height that's basically triple the normal line height. Here it's 78 pixels. And then I've set up my padding bottom to be 2 lines, which works out as 0.851 em, based on this mammoth 61 pixel piece of text. So let's fire up good old HTTP server here. You can check this out on the GitHub repository because all of this stuff is up there. So if I go to localhost, all right, and let me go to my responsive design mode, pull this out a little bit. All right, so what do we know, students of writing, when we have a title like Moby Dick or the Whale and we're using this in a line of text from Moby Dick or the Whale? How do we usually expect that to be styled? Roman or italic? Yes? Ari, say it louder. Italic, right? This is fairly standard that we do major titles of works in italic. Remember, I was rewatching class from Tuesday. So when we talk about a Roman face, that's sometimes called normal. All right? That's when the letters are upright. And then we have our, and this changes. Sometimes it just looks like it's leaning a little bit. But then we have our italic face, all right? Which, depending on the typeface, may look more or less like calligraphy and handwriting, all right? If you take, like, Courier, which has been a big part of my life. I just got my book proofs back yesterday, and they used the wrong variant of Courier in it. And if you use the wrong variant, you get what's known as a faux italic. And in a faux italic, we just shove all the letters so they're looking like they're going to fall over. All right? We want something that's a true italic, and certainly in serifs, a true italic is going to be more than the letters just slanted to one side. They're actually going to be drawn differently. Okay? All right, so let's add something to our style sheet. We've got a piece of structural information for this title, right? We've got our cite tag there, so we can go into our base styles here, and let's start adding some of this stuff. We've got cite, and we want to do font style italic. All right? Now, what typeface is this that we're looking at right now? I haven't set any typefaces in the CSS. So what am I getting? Most likely. Times New Roman, right? Those, well, it's not chunky because I've got all the bold off the headings, but so is this italic, is this a faux italic, or is this a true italic? And if it's true, or if it's false, how can you tell? There's one letter here that gives it away. You've probably never even noticed this before, but this is fairly standard. The E. Well, the E certainly helps, right? The arm that comes across there is now kind of curved up, but there's another letter that gives it away even more. Keep looking for vowels. The A, right? In Roman, we have what's known as a two-story A. Everybody see that? Herman. And then in the italic, we have something that looks more like the cursive A that you learned in grade school if you were taught to write in cursive, right? So that's one of the things that I do when I'm looking at an italic, and if it looks like it's on the borderline, like, I don't know, is that a faux italic or is that true? One of the things I'll look at is the letter A and see if we've got a two-story A or a single-story A like this that looks more like handwriting, okay? So Times New Roman, I mean, I bashed it a lot, but it's not a bad typeface. I mean, it has a true italic, and certainly if we're thinking in the world of default typefaces, you could do a lot worse than Times New Roman. You can also do a lot better than Times New Roman, but it's good to know that we've got this here. Okay. Numbers. How many different kinds of numbers are there in the world typographically? And what kind of numbers are those? What's that? 10 numbers. That's a really good answer, Manish. Yes, 0 through 9. Count them, that's 10. Okay? We have two different styles of numbers. What you see up here are what are known as lining numbers. They all line up on the baseline like that. There are also numbers that are called non-lining or sometimes old-style numbers. They vary somewhat depending. Right? These are called old-style or non-lining numbers. Okay? Has anybody ever seen that? Right? Sometimes you see a date like 1947, and it's loud and proud and big numbers. That, by the way, what line are numbers in Times New Roman? Their top line, what are they aligning with? Somebody was starting to say it. Ascender, yeah, right? Look at the, try to zoom in a little bit more here. But if we look at the top of our M here, even in this blurry view, that's still below our ascender height, right? And if we look at that 1, that's poking up there same size as the L. Now, typographically speaking as a snob, this might be a problem, that the lowercase l and the number 1 looks very much similar, okay? In a newspaper article, who cares? In a lab report or in something where numbers and letters might be intermixed, that similarity might be a bit of a problem. Now, to be true and fair to Times New Roman, if we blow this up a lot, no, I stand corrected. That L and that 1, the difference is just a tiny little bit of curvature underneath the angle there, right? Those are almost identical characters, right? So we would think twice about that, right? And sometimes we'll see Again, depending on how the text is set, we'll see something that looks like that. Why two different styles of numbers? Oh, and P.S., what line do these line up with on the top? X height, all right? So oftentimes, in truly snobbish typographical settings, you'll see 1947 set in display type, right? Do we remember display type? What kinds of elements are set in display type? Starts with an H, rhymes with headings. Headings, very good. Headings, right? So because these things line up with the with the uppercase cap height, we'll often see lining numerals in headings. All right? These guys line up, as Rosa said, with the X height. So we often want to see lowercase or old style or non-lining numerals in the body of our text. All right? Now, not every single typeface on the planet has both sets of numbers. There's also another kind of number that's very close to the lining numbers, and that's called tabular figures, right? Or tabular numbers. And those behave like a monospaced font in that every number takes up the same amount of space. Ordinarily, numbers are kerned, right? So the number 9 is going to take up more horizontal space than our little number 1 is, right? Which is fine if we're talking about a headline, but if we've got columns of numbers like in a well-designed corporate report or a spreadsheet or an investor relation page on your website, it's sometimes helpful to have tabular figures so that you can easily compare them with figures on the line below, right? If it's 347 or something like that, that one sticks out further than if we had non-lining numbers, in which case you might have something like this, right? Where these appear to line up and it's harder to compare them. Okay? All right, what's the other type feature I wanted to talk about? What is this little creature right here? See the FI in find? What happened? The crook on that F has swallowed the dot over the I hole. Right? It's somewhere down in the foot of that F. All right? What is this thing called? And also notice this curious behavior here. I can still select that F. I can also select that FI. Does anybody know what this thing is called? Say it louder, TK.
I said I forgot what it's called.
You forgot what it's called, but you've seen this before. Why does it exist? Well, if we consider a pairing like FL, and if we've got a big bulbous curve like that on the F, and then we have a letter I that comes right after it that basically sits below that teardrop shape, if you've got a separate I thing here, right, dot on that I, this looks like crap, right? It's not easy to read. You have this sort of collision of figures there. So a lot of well-designed typefaces, Times New Roman included, has a certain set of ligatures like FI, like FF, where you'll sometimes see kind of like this secondary little hump that connects with the one there. You'll see FL, which is one of the cooler looking ones because then the L, or the curve on the top of the F goes right down the stem of the L. All right? Anybody here a speaker of German? All right, do you know what famous ligature German has? We don't have it in English. Or we don't anymore, I should say. The PF, no. Has a very specific name. It's used when two S's are side by side in German.
The beta?
It looks like a beta, and a lot of people confuse it as a beta, and then a lot of English speakers, when they first start to read German and start looking up the swear words, they confuse it as a beta. But it's not quite a beta. It's this thing, which is called, in German, an Eszett. All right? And it's used when two S's are next to each other. Okay? In English, like if you look at old printed books from like the 17th century, you'll see that there are two kinds of S's. There's an S that looks like an F, which people also screw up. Okay? It looks like an F, but there's no crossbar here. Okay? So this would be used at the front of a word, I believe in the front of the word or the middle of the word, like we said list, which that would also probably be a ligature as well. All right? But if we have an S at the end of the word, we use the more familiar squiggly snake character that we're used to. All right? German preserves this tradition, which, by the way, anybody read Greek in here? Greek does this too. That's actually where it comes from. A lowercase sigma in Greek looks like that, and a sigma that appears at the end of the word looks like that. It has this big exaggerated hoop here. All right? That's actually where we get this tradition from, is these two different S characters in Greek. So let's also have two different S characters in English. Right? Get all these kinds of little weird features that come over. All right? set, if you're setting German type, that will be very useful to you. But in English, we still have these pairings like this. All right? We also have some Latinate ligatures that we see sometimes. Right? Like if you go and find an old copy of the works of Aeschylus, and I'm going to spell this wrong. I'm embarrassed. It might be AS. It might not have BSC. But anybody ever seen this before? Where else have you seen that? What other word? Old Encyclopedia Britannica. They'll say encyclopedia, like that. All right? That's an old Latinate, old school ligature. What's that? Oh, right, yeah, the old spelling of demon, which comes back in its form in system processes. Okay? So what we're looking at here is a digital marvel that makes life so much happier for us, because even though we're displaying an FI ligature like this, the individual pieces of information that make up that ligature remain. That's why I can still select just the F, and I can still select just the I. If I copy this line of text and paste it into an email that doesn't understand ligatures, it will continue to preserve that. Guess what's behind this? Is this a proprietary Apple technology? No. This is one of these interesting cases where Apple kind of got left behind. This is an open standard. The open standard goes by a slightly different name, but it's called OpenType. And basically in the 1980s, Apple was running wild with all things typographical, and Microsoft was trying to license Apple's typography technology to do things like display ligatures kind of on the fly. And those negotiations broke down, so Microsoft began work on a follow-up to the TrueType standard or specification for fonts and something called OpenType. And then they suddenly had the help of Adobe on this, and then I think it was sometime in the late 90s or the early 2000s, OpenType became an international standard. I think it's ISO 44196 or something like that. But this is now an open standard, and what this does is get at some interesting things that happen. So when I look at my source code, let's find that FI. Here we go. Right? In my source code, that is 2 separate characters. If I was an idiot, I could have my source code display ligatures just like you can in Roman type, but of course we don't want to do that because that makes all kinds of things absolutely crazy. So we have this sort of like triple life of letter forms. We have what I like to call the idea. The idea of F and I. All right? And in computing terms, the idea of F and I or any other character is a binary representation. Right? We can actually look up what in Unicode is the 8 or 16 digit register for F. Same thing with I. Then we have the actual characters that we see displayed on screen. At this point, we're talking about a binary representation that gets transferred to some kind of font representation, right? A true type font or an open type font that has something like F and I. And then finally, through the miracle of open type and devices that support it, we get our ligature, like that, all right? The binary representation remains true throughout. What's significant here is that we can display an entirely different glyph, as it's called, right? If these are sort of like the ideas of F's and I's, we're talking about two glyphs here, right? A F glyph and an I glyph. And here we're talking about a single glyph known as a ligature, all right? And that makes things very, very awesome. Because we can do all kinds of other stuff, like deciding whether we want to do lining or old style numbers. I capitalized old style. It's not the beer. It's, right? It was like all dads in the 1980s drank old style, right? Old style or lining numbers. We can do true small caps. Okay? What are small caps? I know you've been tempted by that button in Microsoft Word before. And sometimes people are tempted by the small caps property that we can do on text transform in CSS. However, oftentimes those are faux small caps, meaning that it takes a regular capital letter set and just runs it slightly smaller. All right? Typefaces that come from good families, no pun intended, right? Because we often talk about a family of type. We'll see one here in a second called Bembo. True small caps are specially drawn to match the X height of the lowercase letters. Okay? They have different strokes. They're closer, if you remember the hierarchy of display, text, and caption. They're closer to the caption drawing. And a lot of times if you have both a caption set and a true small cap, you'll see that they're very similar, right? They don't have quite as much detail, all right? So we want to look at using true small caps. What do you use small caps for? If you're setting a book on web design, what might you use? Say it again? No, nothing. Anybody guess? Why would we want to have a bunch of capital letters in the middle of a sentence? For emphasis? Probably not for emphasis. Actually, quite the opposite, right? Because if we have a line like learn HTML and, right? This draws its attention to itself. So we actually want a true small cap, and of course the spacing's all whack out of here. We want to use a true small cap so that you can read better. So that you don't, every time you see CSS or HTML or XML or whatever the acronym or abbreviation that's repeated throughout, that's not like coming out and making the page difficult to read. Okay? So this is where we tend to use small caps. We also, despite the fact that you can do this, we generally, if we're typographic snobs, and I keep meaning to hold this up in the air, right? This is Robert Bringhurst's, what is this now, the 4th edition of Bringhurst's The Elements of Typographic Style, which is the opinionated typographer's Bible, right? All of this stuff, 120% on our line heights, 45 to 70 character measure, right? Measure is the number of characters, including spaces on a line. All that stuff comes out of Bringhurst. All right? And same thing with Bringhurst, like we don't generally mix true capitals with small capitals. There is a television station that violates this all the time, and it makes it very difficult for me to watch the Olympics. Right? Anybody watch the Summer Olympics? Of course not. I'm the only one who's like interested in pole vaults or whatever it is. Right? You'll see this though all the time in broadcast graphics where they will mix a true cap and a small cap, but they don't stop there. Then they're like, well, we should also have like the faux italic, right, which means the whole thing is just leaned over, and then they'll also make it bold. They'll do all of this horrendous stuff, and it's so ugly, and it makes me so angry because I'm like clutching my copy of Bringhurst while I'm watching gymnasts. I'm like, no, you're doing this all wrong, right? Why do they do this? I don't think it's just because they want to make me mad, although I have sent a sternly worded letter before. Why do they? Why do they do this? Why do we need to mix up our caps and do faux italics that are awful and put bolds in there?
We notice consistency more, so it grabs our attention.
Well, it grabs my attention. I think probably most people are fine with it, but it freaks me out. I'm more interested in like why would they even do this? Why can't we just have like I'm thinking like we could have like right judo I think is an Olympic sport. Why can't we just run that in all caps? Why do we need to do something like capital J and then these faux lowercase? Like why do they do that? It actually has to do with how typefaces are designed for television. Remember Monday I was talking about the history and the stories behind typefaces. A lot of times, like if you go home tonight, go watch SportsCenter, or go watch ESPN, or go watch Chicago Sportsnet. And if you've never heard of television, I'm sorry, and I'm speaking to the wrong group here. But you have typefaces that are specifically designed for things like sporting events, right? So that we can quickly do things like have abbreviations for Chicago's team, and we could have a score. I mean, it's beautiful typography. When it's done right, sports typography is gorgeous. Don't watch the NBC Olympics coverage. Watch SportsCenter. Watch the ticker tape at the bottom of Chicago Sportsnet or something like that. These typefaces are specifically designed for broadcast purposes, which means that if we're going to do something like sports, which is like really intense, right? It's not the PBS NewsHour where it's people holding little brittle cups of tea and discussing the day's event, right? It's SportsCenter, and it's lots of flying graphics and bold colors and animation. So they design these typefaces usually without small letters. There's no lowercase letters in a lot of those broadcast graphics used for sports. So what I think happens up in the production booth when it comes time for the Olympics is that the people at NBC get sad that they only have capital letters, so they start doing whatever their graphics program will allow them to manipulate. So they'll do like a faux small cap like this, and they'll make it italic, because that's the only expressive range that they have. They don't have the ability to do lowercase letters or other things like that, so they just start mucking around and making Robert Bringhurst and me mad, right? Because we want to see type treated correctly, and that sometimes means that we want the type to be treated in specific ways based on how the type was designed. All right, so let's look at an example here. So I set up a collection of typefaces on fonts.com, which is one of two services that I subscribe to because I care that much about typography that I'm willing to give people money for it. So Typekit is one that I use, which used to be an independent outfit, and then they got bought up by Adobe. And then there's fonts.com. Now, the tragedy of Typekit is that, how do you load fonts from Typekit? Anybody used Typekit before? Okay. We load typefaces from Typekit in JavaScript. That's our only option. Which doesn't sound bad, and it's actually quite good, and I'll show you some reasons that it's quite good. But the problem is that Adobe puts beacons in with their JavaScript, which means that if you're like me and a paranoiac and you run an ad blocker, by default, if you set up Ghostery or you set up AdBlock Plus or something like that, or if you're like me and you're crazy and you set up both of them, you won't see the Typekit typefaces that are delivered from Typekit unless you are smart enough to be able to say, oh, we actually want to enable Typekit along with these other list of 12 dozen things that show up on BuzzFeed or whatever it is that you're looking at, right? So this is not fail-safe if you've got the condition of a user who's smart enough to use an ad blocker but not smart enough to know what Typekit is and to whitelist that particular service, all right? Fonts.com will allow us to do JavaScript. It tends to be more spotty as to whether ad blockers block it or not, but it will also do more like what Google Fonts does and allow us to load any typefaces we want via CSS. It will also go a step further, and I'm going to probably start doing this as I'm bringing HTTP2 online with my web server, but it'll also allow us to host the typefaces locally on our own server and serve them up that way. There has to be some kind of transaction with their server, but I've not explored it yet, so we can do self-hosted type as well. All right, I have selected a classic typeface worthy of Herman Melville, even if it has a rather sad-sounding name, Bembo. Has anybody ever read a book in like high school English, or maybe even here, like the Penguin Classics? Right? They have that sort of like cream-colored border and the dark cover. I forgot to bring over. I was going to bring over like Marx or something like that, and we've got a painting on the front. Most of those books, they started to switch them, but most of those were set in Bembo. I believe the Dover Thrift editions used Bembo as well. All right, it is a classic. It's very confusing that this says Times New Roman. All right, it is a classic face. Right, we can see faux italic or true italic. Okay, what tips you off on this one? This has even got something fancier. We got the A, right? Got a single story cursive looking A, but what's the other ostentatious character? The F, right? Like we've now got an ascender on the F, but then whoosh, that thing's got a descender now as well. Which, if you had careful eyes on Monday when I was talking about ITC Serif Gothic on the old Star Wars poster from '77, it had its own custom drawn Roman Fs that had a descender on them. The A was slightly different too. Which, by the way, and you don't deserve this because none of you know Star Wars enough, but...
Are you serious? I'm here today.
Well, you're here today. You weren't here Monday, and that's when I needed you most. We need somebody in the room besides me to be outraged at the lack of Star Wars knowledge. Let's see if we go to ITC Serif Gothic. This is a total aside, right? So, yes, the original '77 poster had a long time ago, right? And it was very crazy in '70s and didn't quite fit the thing. But in 2015, not Awakens, right? That typeface was used again for The Force Awakens, which was a neat throwback to the original '77 thing. Okay, I said that. I got it out of my system. I can move on. So, Bembo. Now, when I set up these typefaces, let me show you a little bit. So again, we can use Google Fonts with CSS, but you oftentimes don't get, and Google, of course, could pony up more money or more resources and change this at any time, but as of today, most open type features are not available on Google Fonts. I think some of their typefaces are coming with ligatures enabled, but lining and old style numerals and things like that aren't necessarily there. So if I look at something like Bembo Roman, italic, semi-bold, bold, extra bold, all right? And we've also got these bold italics, all right? Which, if you are a true pearl-clutching believer of Robert Bringhurst, bold italics are an abomination, right? In classic typeface design, we only had a Roman and an italic. Later, especially in the period of advertising, more faces gained additional weights, and then we took a heavy one of those weights and we just called it bold. All right? But the idea of having like a classic typeface like Bembo have a bold italic, or even worse, an extra bold italic is just sin. All right, that's all you can call it. All right, so if I choose something like just the straight up Roman for setting my text, and of course interfaces are different, but there's an open type tab here, and this tells me all of my open type features. And if I'm doing a complex setting of text, this makes me very happy. All right, let's look at their little, okay? So this has what's known as a case-sensitive form set on them. So that if you do things like square brackets that come before an H, those will be displayed differently than square brackets that come before a lowercase a. All right? Anybody a fan of the iPhone, of the Apple Watch, of the Mac OS operating system? You haven't seen this before, but it's totally awesome. And I'm forgetting the name of the typeface that they went to when they ditched Helvetica Neue Extra Light. If you use a colon, you say, "Sir." That colon sits right on the baseline. Okay? If you look at the time with a colon between it, that colon floats up in between those letters. Right? Check it out. You got to do it. Right? Look at these things. Yeah. That's a case-sensitive form. In this case, it's a number and case-sensitive form. So that we say that despite the fact that this colon is the same glyph, we position it differently when it's used in this particular case of appearing inside a time. All right? We get fractions or denominators on those. Here's our standard ligatures, right? And if you didn't believe me, there's the description. Replaces a sequence of glyphs with a single glyph, which should be that, which is preferred for typographic purposes, right? Here's our lining figures. So we get lining figures with Bembo. We get localized forms. That's more for internationalization. We get numerators. Here's our old style figures, right? And they even do like the old school 619 versus the lining 123. We get true ordinals, okay? Which are, to my mind, kind of ugly anyway, but rather than just taking lowercase letters and squishing them and putting them way up above the baseline, this includes true ordinals. We also have true subscript numbers, true superscript numbers. This one I love a lot. This will do small capitals from capitals. So if we have capital, let me write it again. If we have capital HTML as we would write it in our source code, this will take those uppercase letters and convert them to small capitals. All right? And then it also has a small capitals that will turn anything into small capitals, but it will recognize capital letters, which is usually not what we want unless you're NBC doing graphics for the Olympics. All right? We get certain stylistic alternatives, and we also get some additional stylistic sets, and we'd have to go even deeper. But sometimes you'll see things like the letter Q looks like this in a typeface. They'll have a stylistic alternative that has this big, fancy, long-tailed John Hancock-like swash that goes across half the screen. Those are what's underneath the stylistic alternatives. Okay? So this is all great, and when I go to choose this, and this is a good example of poor design, it's like, yeah, Bembo Pro Roman, have at it. It has all these things. And you're like, great, I'd love to. But of course, I'm a curious person, and I see something like this little pencil, which I don't quite understand what that's about. It says font language Latin 1, okay. I click this, and then I get this extra drop down. What's happening? I go here, and now I've got a whole bunch of different things, right? I've got Latin 1 SC, which is the small capital set. I've got a Latin extended so that we get things like est set and U's with umlauts over them and other kinds of characters. And then the final one down here is I get my Latin extended and open type features, right? One of the things that's great, it used to be that if you chose just the Latin 1 character set, what's Latin 1? What do we call that in character map form? Remember this from kindergarten? ISO 8859 -1. What was that? You're absolutely right. It was the internationalized form of US ASCII. Right? Which was a 255-bit character set that we could use, subsetted to 128 characters. So that was letters like U, right? Western Latin, but not U with an umlaut, or N, but not N with, then I'm forgetting the name of the tilde character in Spanish. Somebody help me. What's that called? Enya, thank you. All right. So we only got the Western non-diacritically marked things in there. All right. So if I chose Latin 1 on this character set, and then I'm getting all excited because I think I'm going to be able to drop umlauts all over the place, or I think I'm going to be able to do small caps, I wouldn't be able to do that. Notice that the font file size is just 21K for that Roman and Latin 1, but it's only 10K more to have the full open typeset. There's been a great deal of optimization that's going on. Used to it was like really big. You'd have, sometimes have twice and 3 times. You still have to watch these page weights, or watch these sizes for what they do to your page weight, right? If you load up every typeface on the whole library because you can't choose one and then you forget to pare it down later, you're going to be bogging people down with lots of resources, and you're going to gobble up their mobile data plans when all you wanted to do was show Bembo. All right? So that's the way that that thing works. So if I look at my little kit that I've put together here, I've got one called ITM 362 Demo. And if I choose this Add and Edit Fonts, all right, I've chosen a conservative set of Bembo, which is to say, I got myself the Roman, I got myself the italic, and I got myself the bold. No bold italic. It's an abomination, right? We'll do bold or we'll do italic. We won't do both, all right? I also chose, just on a lark, Bembo titling. What can you tell me about Bembo titling? It's all caps, right? And not only is it all caps, if we actually go to look at this typeface on fonts.com, where is it? Hello, Bembo titling, where are you? If I choose a different Bembo, they've got a couple of different ones on here. Huh. I don't remember, but you'll have to take it from me on faith. Take it from me on faith. The titling face is not just all caps, right? It's not that it just strips out all the lowercase letters, but if you actually looked at a properly sized piece of titling text, you would see that all of the serifs and all of the lines and curves are much thinner than on the book setting because they're meant to be run at display size, right? So when you blow that up real big, things that work well at small sizes, like nice thick serifs and things to keep it readable, look chunky and gross at larger sizes. So the titling set is designed to be run at bigger sizes, and the way that the type designer envisioned the library is that if you were using titling, it was going to be all caps, all right? And then I've got another set for later in case we get that far. All right, so I want to actually use these things. All right, let's see. Publish options. So I'm going to use the JavaScript version of this, in which case this is just a little obfuscated piece of JavaScript. And then I see here that I get some different font family settings that I can use to refer to my different Bembos. Now, if you're an uncautious person, you'll be like, sweet, Bembo W4, that's the one that I want. And you'd go into your CSS, right? And you just drop this thing in and you'd be like, woohoo, we're done. Now I'm referring to Bembo 04. What is the problem with doing that? Especially if this is how I'm loading my typeface with a piece of JavaScript. right? That's going to load up my typefaces. Here I've chosen font family Bembo W04. Zach.
Is it that if the user doesn't have JavaScript, it's just going to load?
Right. Then it's going to default to whatever wacky typeface they have available. Or if the server at fonts.com or Typekit or Google Fonts or wherever you happen to be loading your typefaces from, if that goes down, then your site is going to display wildly unpredictably. So before we get ahead of ourselves and go nuts loading up a custom face like that, we want to do something like go to a site like CSS Font Stack, and I'm always going to screw this up. Font Stack. I can never remember if it's Stack or Stacks. All right? And this gives us some basic places that we can start. And we can see we've got a few different typefaces that are listed here. Bembo is actually pretty close to Garamond. And I can see that 86% of Windows users and 50% of Mac users have Garamond. So if I click on Garamond, this is my actual font stack. It'll look for Garamond, Baskerville, Oldface, Huffler Text, Times New Roman, and Serif. Ooh, do you everybody see the ligature there? FL? Almost looks like a medieval manuscript A, but it's FL. All right? And then finally, a generic. So what I want to do always is to start not with my ideal face, but with a stack of faces like this to make sure that when I go and reload my page, where is it at? Right? I think that's a Garamond I'm getting there. Ooh, look at that fancy humanist italic there, right? That's much more scripty. That looks very much like Garamond. I mean, look at that T. Look how ostentatious that is. It's a little swash like that. All right? Am I getting... see? This is sad, though. No ligatures. This is why we like ligatures, because we get those little bumps like that. And you might think I'm crazy and this is like my humanities professor coming out or whatever, but that stuff does matter, and it can get really ugly and really distracting. This typeface handles it pretty well. All right. Ooh, but we do get FI. See? So when we see that open type features are available, like it said on Bembo, like, oh yeah, you get ligatures, well, you always have to put a little asterisk next to that. Like, there is at least one ligature in there. Whether it will be every ligature that you want, who knows? So if you're writing copy for a site that sells duffel bags, and you're going to be using the word duffel a lot, and you need that FFL ligature, that might be a deal breaker. Like, you're not going to choose a typeface that doesn't have a good FFL ligature for your duffel bags that you're selling. All right? Although is duffel D-U-F-F-E-L or L-E? Spelling is not my strong suit. All right. So I've got a decent bit of type here. Let me zoom this out. All right. This is acceptable type. So now if I want to, I can go on and I can add to the beginning of this thing, Bembo W04. So the way that we want to arrange our font stacks, and if you're into taking notes, this would be a note to take. We always end with a generic, like serif. Okay? That's a keyword in CSS. It's part of the language. And what it says out of pure and utter desperation to the operating system rendering your CSS is, whatever you think is a serif typeface, go ahead and use it. Okay? So that's the very last thing that we have. In the middle, we want to do all of our system fonts and system alternatives. I'm not going to try to say that, natives. All right? That's what all of these crazy things are. The odds of somebody having Garamond or Baskerville Oldface or Hoefler Text or whatever these, we don't know. So how does CSS work when it goes to applying typefaces? Why don't we start with just serif? Why don't we put serif at the very end? Say it louder. The default's the most common. I mean, if you give a web browser a line of a dozen or more typefaces, how does it choose one? Does it go with its favorite? Yeah, it goes until it finds a match. So if our JavaScript does what it's supposed to do and loads up Bembo in this case, it's going to display Bembo. If Bembo's not available, or if it hasn't finished loading yet, it will keep going through this list of typefaces until it finds a match, and it will stop. So if you become the kind of type snob who thinks Baskerville is an abomination, but Garamond is an acceptable alternative, then you'll keep it like this. If you prefer Baskerville, you can change the order of the font faces. So you load up Baskerville if it's available, and if it's not, then you load up Garamond or whatever. All right? So I save this, and I reload the page here. Boom, there is my Bembo, which I like much better for a 19th century writer like Herman Melville. I think this is a much more effective italic for a 19th century text. It's not quite as loopy and frilly and italic in a humanist script-like way. All right? And then I've got my chapter 1 looming. So now I want to do a couple of things. First is, if I'm loading up JavaScript, I want to assume that it's doing something besides just loading my typefaces. So I'm doing view selection source here in Firefox. Oh, really? I could have sworn. OK. So it's not doing what I had hoped it would, which is to use something that Typekit uses, which is known as the web font loader. So watch this. So I'm going to say, instead of using the default JavaScript from fonts.com, I'm going to use the web font loader from Google. All right, documentation and source in the GitHub repository. All right, so I can load with fonts.com on this. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this little bit of script here, where I'm going to use the web font loader to pull in the typeface that I want from fonts.com. All right, let's see, this is Typekit. Where's my fonts.com? The reason I'm doing this is that what the web font loader will do is add these classes to my HTML element as my typeface is loading. So it will tell me WF loading while the typeface is being loaded up. It'll tell me WF active when everything's loaded and the typeface is displaying. And if something should go wrong for some reason, it will give me this WF inactive class. All right? This is very, very useful for reasons that I'll show you here in just a half a second. So let's find, how do we do fonts.com? Come on. All right. So I've got to do my project ID. All right, I can optionally pass in a version to flush my cache, which could be useful, and this would be optional to load all fonts. So cool. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to go back to my, let's do a commit. So we can get back in case I screw this up. All right, so I'm going to add index.html using default fonts.com JavaScript to load Bembo. And let's look at my screen.css. So what did I do here? I added font stack for Bembo and italicized site. OK, cool. So I can push that. All right, so now I'm going to change this thing up a little bit. And I'm going to load up the web font from Google APIs, which is great. And then I need my kit ID, which I'm guessing is this nice big long string of numbers here. Okay? Which, by the way, is public information. You can go and view source on a page that has a kit. Part of what you do on Typekit and on fonts.com and other custom services, you give them particular domains that are allowed to serve your typefaces. Okay? Be careful of that, though. You'll be like, oh, I'd like to use it with GitHub Pages. And so you slap like github.io, right? That means anybody on a github.io page can serve your font. So you want to say your username.github.io, all right? So because, again, with most subscription services, you get a certain amount of transfer per month. So if everybody in the world is using your copy of Bembo, you're going to be out of page views by like the end of the week, right? Because we know what the market is like for people trying to surf Bembo. They're scheming all the time. All right, so here we go. So we need some script tags to fire up our web font loader. I need my kit ID, which of course will be a string. All right, let's go back to the docs here. All right, here's our web font config. All right, I'll just grab this whole thing. Why not? All right, so I'm going to grab my actual. All right, so I'm loading on my project ID. Fonts.com is run by Monotype. I'm assuming that's why I'm using this Monotype object here. All right, load all the fonts. So let's see what happens when I do this. And of course, it's not going to work because it's that kind of day. Helps if your server's running. Okay, one more time. Yeah, that ain't Bembo. Ooh. Got my project ID. I'll bet if I reverse this, it will work, right? Because I'm defining a variable here, right? It's my web font config, and I had it loaded in script tags below my actual call to this. So I probably, hopefully this will fix it. All right. Yes, that fixed it. Okay, so that was a good catch on my part. So now we're getting Bembo again, but more importantly, we are getting, if I do view selection source again, look at all this. Look at all these beautiful classes that we're getting. Here's Bembo 04, I04 is active. So all of the individual typefaces that I'm loading are all showing up here, right? And finally, I've got this WF active class. This is super helpful because I want to do things like use my titling version of Bembo. So if I go back here, go to my publish options again. All right, this one not so much. This is actually more of an issue in Meta down here, which we're not going to get to in 9 minutes. But I'm going to use this Bembo W01 titling. So let's do this. So let's say for my heading 2, I'm going to do font family. I could do this. I could say Bembo W01. I think that was the version. Titling. W01 titling. All right. If I reload my page, there's my chapter 1 loomings, which of course this viewport is a little too narrow for that size, right? Big, authoritative, like that, okay? Now, the trouble is, when I've got it available, that is the typeface that I want to use. But what are my options here? Do I do another font stack on H2? Do I just replicate, right? Like we can do some experiments and see if we just put in a fake font name, does it default to what HTML does? I don't know. These are all interesting questions. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to use, in my state styles, that WF active selector, which I can use just like that, right? I can put HTML on there if I want to, but I'm going to say when WF active is there, font family on H2, oh, I didn't even have to retype all that, is going to be Bembo titling. Okay? Does everybody see how awesome that is? Probably not. You want to go home. But this is awesome, I'm telling you. Because we can do all kinds of interesting things based on that WF Active class, which means that everything's cool, all the typefaces loaded that we're supposed to, we're ready to go. So we can do whatever we want down here. So that means if we want to make additional adjustments specific to our typefaces, if we want to change the tracking, or we want to do some fancy ligature stuff or open type things, which again we're also not going to get to, which makes me really sad. We're going to push color back next week because I want to do all this stuff with form elements too. But this gives us a way to programmatically go in and make adjustments to our CSS based on the presence of JavaScript. Which, why did I walk over here? What was I expecting to see? Oh, I was expecting to see what I erased. The trouble with both the JavaScript that comes natively from fonts.com and with CSS is that we don't get those nice utility classes. Now, we could hack around in JavaScript ourselves, I'm sure, figure out a way to do this. But again, we'll offload this onto Google, use their standard library of things, and be able to hit the ground running with our typefaces. All right. We got 6 minutes. Let's try to do one open type thing. And actually, these are on our course website for this week, so I'm going to refer to that. I want to do old style numerals on Herman Melville's birth and death dates here. Since this, even though this is a heading 1, I'm treating it basically like a little running head. I'd like to see that run in old style numerals versus my one here in my titling, which we want to keep that as a lining 1 because that's, of course, the usage that we'd expect up there. So let's go to our course site and the typekit reference for open type features in CSS. Go, 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 go. So this is what we get. Here's our ligatures. Here's our letters. Here's our numbers. Okay, old style figures. Unum. All right. Now, this is really sad and tragic, but the only way that we can do this cross-browser, backward compatible, is to grab these 4 lines of browser prefixes, right? So we used to have these old font variant styles. Those have gone away. Now we have font feature settings, but we also want to do the prefixed Mozilla and WebKit versions as well. So I grab those things, and I'm going to put them on my H1. And if I want to, again, because this is dependent on a typeface that actually supports these things. So if I want to be a control freak, which you know how I love to do that, WF Active H1, give me my old style numbers. All right? And when I do that, go back up to my page. And of course, it's not going to do it. There it is. See? Look how fancy. All right, so we can change those things. We've used this selector only on H1. I don't think there's any actual numbers in this running text here. No, we're good here. So we might decide to do that in paragraphs or do another selector as well, but that allows us to grab these open type things. Now, ligatures. There are those open type properties, but there's another property called optimize legibility. And let's go to MDN for optimize legibility. All right, text rendering. Okay, the text rendering CSS property provides information to the rendering engine about what to optimize for when rendering text. The browser makes trade-offs among speed, legibility, and geometric precision. One very visible effect is optimized legibility, which enables ligatures, FF, FI, FL, in text smaller than 20 for some fonts, okay? So if we look at the possible values for this, we can optimize speed, we can optimize legibility, or we can go for geometric precision. If you care about your audience's ability to read your page, this is the one true and holy property, okay? And it looks like Firefox on here is doing it automatically, but if I don't want to mess around, I will add this to my HTML selector and say that we should do text rendering, optimize legibility on this whole page. All right? Most browsers are going to do that automatically, but again, if we do this explicitly, and there my numbers are gone. Come back. There we go. If there's some little bug in Firefox that's making it miss those on certain things. All right? Yeah. I don't know if you can see this, but there are like some very fine features on here, like little swooshes on the one in that titling variant of Bembo. Okay, so next week we'll come back. We're going to see the WF Active thing be even more important with Meta, which we'll use to set some type on a form, and I'll try to start working towards some color things next week because that's what's on the docket for next week as well. Okay? Good luck with your draft projects. I'm looking forward to looking at them and responding to your work over the weekend. All right? All right.